Yeah, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Danny Browning. I work for a little company called Dragos. We are primarily in the OT and ICS space. Gonna do some pseudo ETLing of Suricata with a tool called Vector. This comes from kind of a couple questions, problems I've heard people mention a few times, like how can I perform flow correlations without flow bits? Or it would be really nice if I could kind of combine stuff across flows without having to feed all my traffic to Zeek. Or maybe I just want to combine my stuff before I send it to Elasticsearch or some other thing. I'm not streaming individual events to each of those. Or also just enriching the data that is coming out of Suricata. There's a little bit, some capabilities that have been kind of added over the year, but I just want to do a little bit more enrichment as things go through. So there's a little tool called Vector. It was originally built by this company called Timber.io. They were acquired by Datadog. It's primarily meant for observability pipelines, logs, traces, metrics, that type of thing. But as any terrible engineer can tell you, I've got a hammer, now I'm going to find some nails. So that's where this talk comes in. Bonus, it's open source, so if you have problems, you can submit a pull request. The people maintaining it are really awesome. They're great. So if you need features, they'll help you get them in. They'll help you guide it through it. And it's built in Rust, our favorite language at this conference. All right. So here's kind of a little bit of an overview of Vector. On the left-hand side, we have a bunch of sources, different ones that you can pull in, but it also includes a socket source. Come closer. Is that better? All right. Includes a socket source. For those of you that are intimately familiar with Suricata, we can ship all of our Eve output to a socket via Unix stream. Can even spin off multiples, so you can kind of get a little bit more performance on your output coming out of that. It also has a number of transforms that kind of lives in that little blue vector aggregator box. Ones like aggregation, reduce. It also includes Lua. And if you're really like to punish yourself, you can call Rust code from Lua. It works. I'm not sure if I'd really recommend that, since we're kind of going Rust to Lua to Rust, but you do what you want to do. And then finally, there's something called Remap, the vector remap language that we'll kind of be talking about. And then there's a bunch of syncs on the right side, Elasticsearch. You can even sync from vector to vector, so you can stand up these massive pipelines if you want. Where we really started getting interested in it is what happens when you don't want to, say, run something like Logstash with the overhead of a JVM, or you want better performance. You can't find this slide anymore. There's a bunch of benchmarks. Vector has been kind of hiding them, but it has a very small memory footprint, which was a big bonus for us. It also has really good performance. So that's kind of where we started looking at what could we do with this tool. So in this case, how we're using it in this talk is in a sidecar approach. Our service, in this case Suricata, is logging to a socket. Vector is going to pull in that data and then transform it, do whatever you want to it, and then can forward it on. All right. Vector works on a bunch of configuration files. You can specify it in TOML, YAML. This talk uses the YAML syntax. So the most straightforward kind of in-out is we're going to have a socket that comes from Suricata. There's our Eve.json Unix stream. And you can immediately redirect that to a sink and just see all your Eve.json on the console if you want. So you can see every message that comes out of there and see what's coming across the Unix socket. Pretty straightforward. But we can then build on that. The first kind of transform we can do is the remap, like I was talking about, vector remap language. In this case, it's kind of a Rust-like syntax. So here's a very simple one. We just have this message coming from Suricata, parse it as JSON, log it out. Nothing too crazy there. It's pretty much a one-to-one. It's a stateless transform, so every event just gets turned into something else. There's also something called reduce. This is where we can be doing some batching and combining. So multiple events come in, we put them out to one. In this case, we're grouping by a flow ID. So this is something where you could combine everything you see on that single flow. Every single HTTP event, merge it all together, and now you just have one event. There's a new functionality coming. It's enrichment. So you start out with a CSV file. Don't read too much into these examples. They were very useful, but in this case, we have some DNS and we want to give it a severity. So we put that in a CSV file. We then load that into our configuration. There we go. And then, same thing, we can do in our remap. We can get the record for that. In this case, look at some DNS, set some severity. So every event now has some severity associated with it. And then, if you've ever worked with Logstash, one of the most annoying things in the world is actually testing your configs before you try to do anything with them. There's 42 different tools now to actually test your stuff. Vector comes with that built in, so you save yourself a bunch of headaches. There's something called validate. You can check your topologies, make sure all your sync sources and transforms are correctly connected. It will tell you what's going on. There's also tests. You can actually write unit tests for all these configs you're building. Yeah, that shows up sort of well. So here's a test. We can insert inputs into any part of our pipeline. We can then check our outputs. So in this case, we could insert HTTP into some of those transforms we were doing, come out and see like, yeah, it produced one HTTP or it produced 2 or 4, however many you want. Now, I did not sacrifice a Bellini to the demo gods, so cross your fingers. And let's see what we get here. All right, just in case you're not familiar with it, first of all, we set up our Suricata to output to EUJSON. Kind of our top level config, this is what we were talking about before. We have a source coming from Suricata. We then have some sync. Pick your sync, it's a demo, so you guys get to see the console. Here is the transforms. This is a full-on transform we're going through. Enrichment tables up above. Here I'm parsing out my JSON. I then have, if I have HTTP events, I'm actually gonna pull out a bunch of host names and stick them in a host array. I'm also gonna put all our HTTP in another array. If there wasn't any, just leave it empty. Kind of do the same thing for DNS. Now I'm gonna run through an enrichment step. So if there was a query that was set in the previous step, I can go and pull the severity out of that CSV that I had set. I can then batch all these events. In this case, I'm batching by a key, which I set to be the source IP. So I'm actually gonna look at all the events that impacted the source IP. You can make bigger, smaller keys, change them however you want. Merge it a couple ways. So HTTP and DNS are all gonna get put into one big array. The severity I'm actually gonna sum up. So as I run into these different things, it's gonna get a higher and higher severity as I go along. Finally, come back through, see if I had a high enough severity, and if it actually talked to a host I'm interested in. And then finally, just do a little bit extra stuff there where I'm kind of cleaning up my stuff before I pass it along to my output. I can also run a test on this. So here's all my Suricata output. When I showed you that first source and sync, that was an easy way for me to just get all these test inputs for my tests. So I can put them in here, throw it out, make sure everything came out. And let's see, so vector test, throw in the test I want to do, boom, see it comes out, see that my test passed. I'm now going to run vector. You'll see that it loads up a bunch of stuff. And then I can take and run Suricata here. Vector pops out. I'm going to go ahead and force it to emit everything. And one of the things we see up here is that now we have this nice big mega event we created, but it actually alerted. So we could actually, if it didn't alert, throw all those events away that don't alert and then pass those along. So there you go. There's a rundown of using Vector and Suricata together to kind of do some fun stuff as a sidecar process.
Thanks, Danny. We could probably do one question or two quick questions, not a Victor length question.